Being the greatest mage in Tamriel's history has nothing to do with how many spells you know. Vanus Galarian founded the Mages Guild, Divaith Fear filled a fortress with clones of himself, and Mannimarco turned death into a job title. Each of them paid for their power with something they never got back. That's why today, I'm ranking the 8 greatest mages in Elder Scrolls lore and what each one gave up to earn their spot. Starting with the founder, whose greatest spell was an institution, not a fireball. Vanus Galarian. Think of him as the guy who invented the school instead of the guy who tops the class rankings. Almost every other name on this list, the ones who came after him anyway, learned their craft inside a building he designed, using a curriculum he wrote, under rules he enforced. That's the problem. He built the entire exam and then scored somewhere in the middle of it. Vanus Galarian founded the Mages Guild, the institution that turned magic from a scattered, dangerous, every wizard for himself situation into something you could actually teach a person. Before him, magical knowledge lived in scrolls guarded by paranoid hermits and dead languages rarely translated for the public. After him, it lived in classrooms. Continent-wide classrooms, staffed and funded and stocked with libraries, spreading across Tamriel like a franchise that actually delivered on its promises. That's an enormous legacy. It is also notably not a spell. Search the lore for Vanus Galarian's greatest individual feat of magical combat, and you find solid but unspectacular entries, impressive by any normal standard, but nothing that reshapes a continent. Compare that to the names waiting later in this list, mages who reshaped landscapes, rewrote their own mortality, or turned death into a personal employee. Vanus wrote policy. He recruited. He negotiated funding and structure, and standardized training so that talent didn't have to depend on which hedge wizard happened to like you. Some fans rank him as the single most important mage in the guild's entire history, and the case is a strong one. Continent-wide institutions don't build themselves, and few others on this climb can claim they personally created the pipeline that trained their own competition. But greatest is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and Vanus represents one specific answer to it. Magic as civilization, not conquest. That puts him on the opposite end of the spectrum from men like Mannimarco, who saw the same raw material and asked how much of it he could hoard for himself. Vanus spent his years on scaffolding, not spellcraft, on other people's careers instead of his own myth. The guild remembers his name, but ask what he could actually do with a staff in his hand, and the answers get vague. Building the schoolhouse gets you respect. The next name on this climb never sat in one, and what he pulled off alone in the wilderness gets repeated so often as legend that you have to wonder how much of it would survive somebody actually checking the receipts. Shalador. Ask anyone steeped in the lore to name the greatest mage Tamriel ever produced, and Shalador is often the first name out of their mouth. He is a recurring answer, the name that surfaces before most people even check a source. That speed is the strange part. Vanus Galarian left behind founding charters, dated splits, a school with his fingerprints all over its bylaws. Shalador left behind stories so old that separating the man from the myth is basically impossible at this point. He is tied to ancient Skyrim, an archmage from an era so distant that most of what survives about him reads like scripture rather than a resume. Shalador's mirror, Shalador's insight. Labyrinthian itself, a maze reportedly built by his own hand and scaled like something meant to test archmages themselves. These are not spell components. These are landmarks with his name still bolted to them thousands of years later. Community discussions keep dragging his name back near the top of the list, and many players who rank other mages higher still acknowledge him as the classic benchmark. That is a specific kind of power. Vanus built an institution people could join. Shalador built a reputation people could only inherit secondhand, generation after generation, each retelling adding a little more shine. Here's the catch nobody likes sitting with for too long. Strip away the maze, the mirror, and the epithets, and the documented spells that remain are so tangled in legend that separating fact from fiction is its own puzzle, and the personality that survives in the records is fragmentary at best. Vanus left behind a charter that codified how magic should be taught. Few arguments from Shalador survive in the record. Shalador got mythologized. Very little in the lore reliably separates the historical wizard from the folk hero built on top of him afterward. That gap is exactly the one dedicated fans keep circling. Is Shalador genuinely the strongest mortal caster the setting ever produced, or is he simply the oldest name still standing after centuries of storytellers rounding him up? The stronger reading leans toward legend doing most of the lifting, and the games have never bothered to settle it either. What's certain is the price. Whatever the real Shalador once wanted, feared, or loved got erased somewhere between the man and the maze he supposedly built to outsmart death itself. The emotional core keeps repeating itself here. Power bought with a life, spent down to nothing, leaving a title standing where a person used to be. A legend costs you your face. There is a wizard who solved that problem the direct way, by simply refusing to die for thousands of years, and the fortress he filled to keep himself company is one of the loneliest images in the series. Dvaithfir solved loneliness the way a wizard solves everything else. He built himself some company out of raw magic. That sounds charming until you clock what it actually means. His daughters, the Telvanni sorceress hags wandering the halls of Telfir, are magical constructs he manufactured as a side benefit of his research into Corpus, the disease that was eating Vardenfell alive. Whatever he felt about the people he'd outlived, the record stays silent on it. What's documented is the science, not the sentiment. Fear is old enough that the number stops meaning anything useful. Estimates place him past 4,000 years old, a stretch of time that makes Vanis Galarian's founding of an entire school of magic look like a weekend project. He was already alive and studying magic when the Dwemer vanished from Tamriel, though the legend status came later. He left Artaeum as a sharp-elbowed upstart, and his reputation only caught up with his talent over the following millennia. He was still active and lucid during the Nerevarine story, and he kept running experiments long after that story wrapped up. He was born as a chimer in Tel Aruan before joining the Telvanni, and he outlived generations of rivals who might have challenged him for the title of most dangerous wizard in Vardenfell. They died. He simply didn't. What he did with all that borrowed time is the part that earns him a seat at the top table. Fire's magical range covers enchantment, alchemy, Daedric summoning, biological engineering, and soul manipulation, and he's documented pulling off major feats across most of those fields. He engineered Corpus immune test subjects out of a disease that turns most victims into shambling wrecks. He built magical constructs advanced enough to pass as living people, and did it more than once. Fan power rankings put him among the very highest mortal mages for exactly this reason: breadth over spectacle, a resume 4 millennia deep instead of one legendary showpiece moment like Shalador's Labyrinth. That's a common argument in top mage debates, and the depth of his catalog is what makes it stick. That's the case for him as the most complete practical mage in the series. Total command of the craft, 4 millennia of research, 0 mythic gimmick required. He skipped the part where he had to vanish into a story the way Shalador did. You can walk into Telfir right now and talk to the man himself. Talk to him long enough, though, and the cost surfaces. Fear built daughters out of a Corpus experiment, and whatever company he might have had otherwise is long gone to time. He talks about the Dwemers vanishing like it happened last Tuesday, because for a man on his timeline, it more or less did. That's what 4,000 years of study actually buys. Total mastery of magic, in a world that emptied out around him while the research kept going. Outliving everyone is one answer to death. There is a colder answer, which is to stop asking death for permission and start giving it orders. And the mage who did that turned the end of every life in Tamriel into a labor supply. Mannimarco, King of Worms. A dead man wearing a fresh nickname would be terrifying enough on its own. Mannimarco, the King of Worms, treats the entire concept of a corpse as a resource he owns outright. Fear spent his own years creating clones from his own flesh, 4 daughters born as a side benefit of his Corpus research. Mannimarco found a cheaper account to draw from: yours. The worm cult follows Mannimarco's teachings, treating death as raw material and looking to him as the architect of what their necromancy can build. He commands domination over death and soul-related magic as a governing force, bending souls, corpses, and the boundary between the living and the dead to his will across multiple eras of Tamriel's history. That kind of staying power comes from a system, not a lucky streak. His necromancy and the worm cult's rituals are built around channeling death into power, and over centuries that accumulation has made him nearly unstoppable. That's the mechanism fans often point to when his name comes up in these rankings. He shows up regularly in discussions of the strongest mages in Elder Scrolls lore, and the case for him is embarrassingly simple. He has spent centuries proving he is extraordinarily difficult to stop permanently, because permanent solutions require the target to actually stay dead. Multiple confrontations across multiple eras end the same way, with Mannimarco surviving in some form while the mortals who fought him age, retire, or stay dead in the ground. He could match any rival spell for a while, sure, but then he made the entire question of casting bigger spells far less relevant by making death far less of a limiting factor than it is for everyone else. The fandom's counter-argument is exactly as sharp as the case for him. If your win condition is refusing to lose the game, are you still playing the same game as everyone else? Part of the debate wants to crown him outright. The rest wants him disqualified, arguing that once you're feeding on souls to maintain your own existence, you've drifted out of mortal mage territory and into something closer to a force of nature than a mortal mage. Nothing in canon settles this argument outright, but the pattern is loud enough to follow on its own. A figure who blurs the line between mage and godlike entity forfeits the clean comparison to mages who have not found a way around the ordinary limits of a mortal lifespan. Here's the detail that should bother you more than the raw power does. Fear filled a fortress with clones, with the bodies emerging as a side benefit of his corpus research. Whether it was for company after 4 millennia or for his experiments, the result was the same. Mannimarco sidesteps that problem because the dead he surrounds himself with rarely stay gone long enough to be missed. In effect, every ending he touches becomes fuel instead of loss, and you could say the price tag on his immortality never shows up on his own ledger. It shows up on somebody else's, over and over for centuries. You could say paying with other people's lives buys enormous power, and the toll it charges is the title of mortal. Directly beneath that trade sits a wizard who refused it completely, stayed stubbornly, rudely alive on his own terms, and still ended up with a mastery that ranks among the highest in Tamriel, Neloth. Neloth's greatest magical achievement might be surviving 380 years without anyone strangling him for his personality. That's not an insult to his sorcery. His enchanting is genuinely elite, his experimentation is relentless, and he read the Red Mountain warning signs early enough to relocate off Vardenfell and grow Tel Mithrin from cuttings on Solstheim before the Red Year buried his old home in ash. He is centuries old and still exactly the same abrasive Telvanni master he must have been at year 1. Telvanni mages measure status in tower height and personal reputation, and Neloth sits near the top of both. He ranks among the most respected living wizards in Morrowind, a master of enchantment and sorcery who trains the last Dragonborn, studies Dwemer sites plenty of scholars leave alone, and treats a functioning ancient superweapon like a broken kettle he's annoyed about fixing. He is the wizard players actually spend hours with, which makes him the ruler everyone else on this list gets measured against. His resume backs it up. He implanted a heartstone in his own apprentice, Ildari Sarathril, just to see what it would do to her, and he burned through a rotating cast of assistants he treats as expendable lab equipment. Ask him about the ones who suffered testing his theories and he shrugs. That's the cost of his centuries, externalized onto apprentices and test subjects, while he keeps every year for himself. That's where he splits from the last name on this climb. Mannimarco built an entire religious order and a soul-trapping industry to spread his price for immortality across an empire's worth of victims. Neloth never bothered founding a faction or toppling a government. He never reshaped Tamriel the way Mannimarco or an empire's founders did, and his magic stays mostly local, felt across Solstheim and Tel Mithrin rather than the continent, exactly as large as his own ego, which is considerable but not that. Nothing in canon ranks him below Shalador or Mannimarco outright, but follow the pattern this video is built on. The names above him reshaped a nation, an era, or death itself, while Neloth reshaped a mineshaft and his own daily schedule. Many fans love him as a rare top-tier mage who still feels dangerously powerful without needing a continent to prove it. Staying a recognizable person keeps you easy to rank. Directly above that sits a figure so tangled in the founding of an empire that the argument stops being about how strong he was and becomes about whether the thing left behind still counts as a mage or just a wound. The world never closed. The Underking, Zurin Arctis. Somewhere in the Third Era, the Imperial Battle Mage traded his own species for a job title, and historians still argue about what he actually became. Zurin Arctis served as Battle Mage to Tiber Septim, the wizard behind the throne during the wars that built the empire. Then he vanished into a legend called the Underking, and the wizard's resume turned into a footnote buried under centuries of speculation. The official story stops being useful almost immediately. Arctis is tied to the Numidium, the animunculus that helped finish the Empire, and his fate gets wrapped up in the metaphysics of that machine rather than any spell list you could point to. You cannot rank him by fireballs cast or enemies frozen, because the sources barely bother tracking that. What they track instead is scale. An empire reshaped, a magical theory rewritten, a man who stopped being classifiable as a man. That is the detail that makes him worth including at all. Dvaith Fear spent centuries hoarding his own genius behind a fortress wall, and that already sounded extreme. Arctis went further and spent his identity, the actual noun that would let you say he was a person, in exchange for a role that defies easy description. Lore debates put him below the outright reality benders in a straight fight, the ones who could casually restructure a planet, but he lands above plenty of famous spellcasters purely on the strength of what his existence implies about the limits of magic itself. Nothing in the sources spells out a clean power ranking for him, so treat that placement as the working theory it is, not settled canon. Even the basic label is disputed. Some fans call him a mage who leveled up into something unrecognizable. Others call him a side effect, a leftover consequence of the Numidium project wearing a name for convenience. Follow the pattern far enough, and both readings start to look like the same problem. The fandom cannot settle on the category, because the category may not exist anymore. That is the actual horror sitting under the trivia. Most of the mages on this list spent years chasing power. Arctis spent something closer to the coordinates of who he was, the reference point that lets a historian say here is where this person begins and ends. Lose that, and greatness stops being measurable in any language we have. Being too strange to classify at least keeps you in the conversation. There is a name that survives in a handful of scattered references and almost nothing else, and the fight over whether it belongs beside these giants exposes what a magical reputation is actually made of. Air got a footnote, and even that footnote is doing a lot of guessing. You have watched this video build entire reputations out of a few surviving sentences, and Air is where that habit runs out of material to work with. Compare that to Shalador, whose legend arguably grew so large it outran the man underneath it. Air got the opposite treatment. The record barely wrote about her at all, and the silence stayed silence, with no later myth-making stepping in to fill it. That absence is the entire discussion. Nothing in canon says outright how many texts once existed about her, but the pattern of what survives points to a career the archive simply lost interest in preserving. What she has instead is a single surviving detail. She summoned the first Iron Atronach bear, and almost nothing else. Canon tells you almost nothing about what she accomplished. One conjuration feat and then silence, and that gap is worth sitting with instead of filling in, which makes the argument over her a strange one to imagine playing out. Anyone debating her placement would have to argue in the language of achievement while the achievements themselves stay off the table. What's on the table is a threshold question. How many surviving paragraphs does it take to call someone great, and does an empty column in the record mean nothing happened or just that nobody wrote it down? The camps in that debate would likely talk past each other, answering different questions under the same heading. Think back to the Underking for a second, a figure who became too strange, too contradictory, too layered in false identities for the archive to pin down. Air is the cheaper version of that same failure. In a sense, he broke the record by being too much. She breaks it by being too little. Both endings point at the same uncomfortable idea. Greatness in this world gets graded on what somebody else bothered to preserve, not on what you actually did. And that should worry you more than a legendary sorcerer getting inflated into myth, because inflation at least leaves you something to argue with. This leaves you almost nothing. A mage who may have spent a real ordinary life chasing power, only to have the archive quietly decide one conjured bear was the only line worth keeping. The record can starve a mage into a footnote without even trying. Somewhere else in Tamriel, one figure gave up more of themselves than anyone on this list, on purpose, and still walked away with a fortress, a title, a prophecy, and a god's job description, and the strangest part of the whole climb is that nobody left standing can tell you their name. The Nerevarine. Every mage on this list kept something. The Nerevarine is the one entry that arrives with no fixed identity to protect, and this section reads that blankness as one way to explain why the title lands here. Consider the resume attached to that empty slate. Prisoner on a boat to Vardenfell, the game never even fixes a race or a gender before it. By the end of the main quest, that prisoner can be recognized as Nerevar Reborn, a Chimer hero dead 4,000 years, can optionally take Trebonius' place as Archmage of Vardenfell, and has already put down Dagoth Urur. Vanis Galarian founded the Mages Guild, and left an institution standing behind him. Dvaith Fear got a fortress full of daughters wearing his own face, a side effect of his corpus research. Mannimarco chose undeath and recurring return over a single ending. The Nerevarin's resume reads like it was assembled from other people's titles: Nerevar Reborn, Archmage, Hortator, and the character started the story with a blank one. Fans argue endlessly about where that puts the Nerevarine on a power ranking, and the argument itself proves the point. Rank on raw versatility, magic and swordplay, and diplomacy and prophecy all stacked on one character, and few fixed lore figures carry that same stack. Rank on a fixed magical ceiling, the way you'd rank Vanus or Fear against a defined feat, and the Nerevarine has no ceiling to measure because the player writes it session by session. Some fans put the Nerevarine at the very top for exactly that unlimited potential. Others rank them lower because the canonical ceiling never gets pinned down. That gap may be the result of ranking a character whose story was deliberately left open-ended. Morrowind's ending left the Nerevarines' fate open. The Nerevarine can become Archmage of the Vardenfell Mages Guild, and beyond that, there's only a rumor of an expedition to Akavir to go on. The Nerevarine began with no fixed name or past, and the story fills that vacancy with the authority of the Nerevarine prophecy and the defeat of a god. Vanus kept his institutions standing after him. Fear kept centuries. Neloth kept his temper and his contempt for everyone around him. The Underking kept a title whose holder is still disputed. The Nerevarine walked onto that boat with no history of their own, and that absence is one reading of what let a dead hero's name, an optionally held Archmage's chair, and the weight of a slain god's defeat all move in and take up residence. Every mage on this climb spent some piece of an ordinary life to buy their power. Vanus spent his years building an institution that would outlast him. Fear spent long stretches alone at Telfir, outliving nearly everyone who might have called him a friend. Mannimarco faced death repeatedly through undeath, persisting where others would have ended. The Nerevarine spent the blank identity that was uniquely theirs, and walked away with a hero's identity, an optional Archmage's title, and Dagoth Ur's defeat stacked on top of the vacancy. The greatest mage in the Elder Scrolls is the one who kept the least of themselves standing at the end. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.